Hello, everyone. My name is Kaeli Swift, and I am excited to present my postdoctorate work that I'm doing with the University of Washington, studying the Chicharian Tinian, or the Tinian monarch. So first, I want to provide some broad natural history information on what's already known about this bird. Tinian monarchs are a small, about 12-gram insectivorous flycatcher. They are endemic to Tinian, though a 1996 study by Peters suggested that there may be a possibility of a historic population on Saipan as well. Males and females are sexually monomorphic, and juveniles pretty quickly adopt the adult-looking basic plumage, though they can be distinguished from adults by this bicolored bill that you can see in the central photo here, that kind of orangish, yellowish tinge at the base, though for how long that discoloration persists, I don't know. It's believed that Tinian monarchs nest primarily in native limestone forests, though they can also use secondary forests as well as homogeneous tangan patches. They typically lay 1 to 3 eggs, though generally we see 2, and are believed to breed year-round. Like most living things in the CNMI, Tinian monarchs have been subjected to a very long history of disturbance, starting most significantly in the 17th century with the colonization from the Spanish. And it was at that time that cattle were first introduced and more of the landscape started to be converted for agricultural purposes. Then from 1926 to 1940, much of Tinian was converted into sugarcane fields under the Japanese occupation. And then finally, most remaining native vegetation was destroyed via the various military campaigns during World War II, and by the subsequent introduction of tangan by the US military, which was probably done to cease erosion. So now it's estimated that only about 5 to 7% of Tinian is actually native forest. Given this long history of disturbance and landscape changes, it's perhaps no surprise that this bird has had a very fraught conservation history. It was first listed by the service as endangered in 1970, and that was in response to a number of informal reports, most notably one that came out in 1945, just after the war by Glees, that suggested there may only be 40 to 50 individual monarchs left on Tinian. But the service didn't actually conduct a formal assessment of this species until well after it was listed in 1982. And at that time, they actually found that monarchs were the second most abundant bird on Tinian, with a population of about 38,000 individuals. So following that, it was downlisted to threatened in 1987. And then the service performed another formal assessment in 1996, where they found that the population was actually 54% larger than they had projected in 1982. And so with that, in 2004, it was eventually delisted. The next major population estimate attempt was conducted in 2008. There they found a decrease, kind of returning back to those 1982 numbers, around 38, 39,000 individuals. And so if those estimates are an accurate reflection of population trends, that's clearly a worrying trend from 1996 to 2008. And that is why we are so interested in continuing the monitoring of this species. Abundance and population estimates are not actually the focus of what I'm going to be doing, though. Our main study objectives are to answer questions about both demographic information and reproductive activity, more with the aim of figuring out how to best manage this species moving forward. So with respect to demographic information, the kinds of things we will be assessing are things like site fidelity, juvenile and adult dispersal, and finally survivorship. And then with respect to reproductive activity, we're most interested in trying to assess reproductive output and success across various habitat types, to identify causes of nest failure. There are no brown tree snakes on Tinian, though there are a variety of other invasive predators that can be quite problematic. And then finally, we want to better characterize nest site selection so that we can more effectively manage vegetation and habitat management plans for this bird and other forest birds. So to address our demographic goals, and really this helps address all of the goals of this project and is one of the biggest components of it, we are trying to establish a pretty robust study population across 3 of those habitat types we already know the monarchs use. And that includes native limestone, secondary forests, and Tinian. And within each one of those habitat types, we are hoping to discover 20 nests, and then of course have those nests be tied to banded adults and then subsequently band their juveniles, so that we can get a pretty complete idea of who's doing what and where and how successfully. The map you can see on the right, all of this work is being conducted on the military lease lands, which comprise about 70% of the island of Tinian. And you can see those various yellow shapes in there. Those are denoting the different study sites that we have. There's 6 study sites overall, so we have 2 of each for each one of those habitat types. For reproductive success, we are mainly assessing that via nest searching, and most of the nest searching we're doing is just cold searching. Obviously, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage with this species relative to any North American birds because they do breed year-round, so it's always kind of a guessing game, though we have seen some trends in kind of when activity picks up and then when it starts to decline. But mainly how we're going about this is once we band birds, once we identify territories, we visit their territory once a week and look really diligently across the areas that we have learned monarchs seem to like to nest and hope that we find something. And then of course, in addition, we're always looking for behavioral cues that might indicate breeding activity, like gathering nesting material or gathering food for fledglings or nestlings. And then when we do find nests, we deploy Reconyx Hyperfire camera traps, and that's going to be what allows us to monitor for causes of nest failure. And then finally, once the outcome of a nest is known, it either succeeds or fails, we are conducting vegetation measurements and various other measurements that will allow us to characterize exactly how monarchs choose the places they put their nests. And so in total, we are measuring 15 habitat characteristics. 12 of those are specific to the microsite where they put their nests. So that includes taking data on what kind of plant that they put their nest in, how far off the ground is it, what's the orientation of the nest on the plant, what's the distance from the nest to the substrate center, those kinds of things. And then in addition, within a 10-meter radius plot, we're also measuring broader habitat characteristics. So things like what is the dominant ground cover, what's the percent canopy cover, et cetera. And then to really round things out, we're not only taking those measurements where the actual nests are, but we're also pairing them with another randomly selected site in the territory, so that we not only are taking data on where monarchs are choosing to put nests, but we're also collecting very similar data in places within their territory where they are not choosing to build nests. So the fieldwork for this project only started in February. So we're still in very early days, and the work and the results I'm going to be presenting now are very preliminary. But so far we have banded 70 birds, which reflects a pretty massive effort. 57 of those have been adults, 9 have been subadults, and then we've banded 4 nestlings. We don't know the sex ratios of those birds, again, because they are sexually monomorphic. Really the only way that you can confidently sex them in the hand is when females are displaying a brood patch, but of course that may not always be available information to us. So we've actually just sent off our first batch of feathers to the Bishop Museum in Hawaii for genetic analysis. So hopefully we'll know more about that soon. Based on the resite data that we have so far collected, we've estimated our territories to be 0.39 hectares. And I'll talk more a little bit later about how that compares to what's been previously observed. With respect to reproductive success, we have found 10 nests so far. 7 of them have been in secondary forest, 2 have been in Tinian, and we've only found 1 in native limestone forest. Of those 10, we've had a 30% success rate. We had 1 case of abandonment, 1 case of a nest that failed for mysterious reasons, there didn't seem to be any problems with the camera traps, and we had 2 on them, and it just, yeah, I can't explain it. So we had a mystery failure, but the main causes of failures have been nest predators, including collared kingfishers. We had 1 instance of that. Domestic cat, we had a single instance of that, though in that case, the cat was actually targeting the incubating adult, but it flicked out when it attacked the adult, it flicked out the nest contents. But by far, the most common nest predator we've seen so far are rats. They've accounted for 3 of our nest failures. And so like many of our other forest songbirds, rats are a big problem. With respect to nest site selection, we found that monarchs are selecting a variety of different kinds of plants on which to build their nests, including kamachili, fig, tangan, and noni. They nest pretty close to the ground, and we already knew that generally, but we found that on average, our nests are 153 centimeters above the ground. That 10-meter radius around the nest, the ground cover is primarily characterized by plant litter and then to some extent by vegetation. And they appear to select a more closed canopy at about 70%. We also have found that they nest near tall trees, and by tall, I mean about 10 meters, though we need a lot more data, particularly that paired data, to really parse out if they're actually selecting sites close to tall trees or if their territories just have a lot of tall trees. And so it's sort of inevitable. We find, perhaps unsurprisingly, given our results so far in predation, that their nests are very poorly concealed. On average, there is 94% visibility in all 4 cardinal directions. So they're not exactly inconspicuous. And they're also pretty easily accessible. So once we started to see trends with rats coming in, one of the things that we've added to our data collection methods is counting and assessing how many climbable surfaces are within a ½ meter of the nest. And so far we've seen on average, there are 8 different points that something like a rat could use to access those nests. So better quantifying that will potentially be really helpful in ways that we could maybe manage the landscape to prevent those kinds of invasive predators. So like I said, this is all early days. So these are very, very preliminary data, but we have seen so far that territory size seems to be fairly consistent with what had been previously reported. It's a little bit on the large size, but of course, most of our nests have come from secondary forests, and that territory estimate that's published in the literature previously primarily reflects territories in native limestone, where we might expect them to be smaller because there's more resources. So we'll see as we get a more even distribution of nests across our habitat types if that number changes. We have seen some evidence of site fidelity. So we've only had 1 pair whose nest failed and then attempted to re-nest. And that pair actually did so within 9 days of the nest failing. And when they rebuilt within 2 meters of the old nest. And happily, they are actually one of those 3 territories that eventually did successfully fledge their nest. And then lastly, we've obviously seen that the nest success rate is pretty low, and that's attributable mainly to introduced predators as opposed to environmental factors or other kinds of stochastic events. Future efforts will focus on just continuing what we're doing, building up that steady population, finding more nests, collecting the subsequent data. But we're also going to be including telemetry in the future so that we can more specifically and accurately measure dispersal. And in addition, we can validate whether or not the data we collect through more classical methods of territory mapping are actually or not accurately reflecting territory size. So with that, I want to thank and acknowledge the historic and continued preservation of this species by the Chamorro people. I want to thank John Gurley, Jerica Santos, and Jill Liskey-Clark for their technical support. And lastly, I would like to thank Fletcher Moore, Nathan Johnson, and Jay Camacho for their contributions to the fieldwork. And with that, I would be glad to take any questions you might have. Thanks so much.